And now, as the last lecture of our celebration, I introduce you Professor Luis Sass. He's this distinguished professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology of the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University, where he is also affiliated with the Comparative Literature Program in the Center for Cognitive Science. Sass has published extensively on schizophrenia, phenomenological psychopathology, psychoanalysis, hermeneutics, and the thought of Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Foucault, as well as on modernism, postmodernism, and other cultural issues. He is the author of Madness and Modernism, Insanity in the Light of Modern Art, Literature and Thought, and the Paradox of Delusions, Wittgenstein, Schreber, and the Schizophrenic Mind. He has also extensive curriculum as a visiting professor at many universities, such as like the University of Chicago, Paris, Oviedo in Spain, uh, Colombia, and Mexico. I welcome you, Professor Luis Sass. I'm sorry for my mistake, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, thank you, Fabio, and thank you for the organizers of this wonderful event. It's an honor to be speaking here, and it's an honor to be able to honor our eminent predecessors in philosophy and the mental health sciences and professions. It's also a pleasure to be here, if only virtually, with friends from the UK, from Brazil, from Italy, and from many other countries, I imagine. What I'm going to do today, and I'll speak for about 20 minutes, I think, is to offer some rather general reflections on our field of phenomenological psychopathology in its relationship to philosophy and other fields, and I hope that will be appropriate for this centenary event. Can you see me okay now? Because I have my text in front of me. I trust this is good?
Yes, it is good.
Okay, so the heart of the matter is my title, On Phenomenological Psychopathology. So if we define philosophy simply as love of knowledge, then it's obviously a requirement for any serious scientific, scholarly, or professional pursuit in whatever field. Philosophy's relevance is also wide-ranging and even universal when we define it as the most basic or general discipline, the discipline that poses foundational questions regarding the nature and the legitimacy of knowledge itself. Philosophy does seem, however, to have special pertinence or relevance for the human sciences, and perhaps especially for the mental health-related disciplines. Fields like psychiatry and clinical psychology often seem to run the risk of degenerating into one or another form of what one philosopher of science called a degenerating research program, whether this takes the form of reductionism, rigidification, or mere banality. This, at least, was the view of Karl Jaspers, whose crucial book, The General Psychopathology, first appeared in 1913. As Karl Jaspers put it, quoting, "To sum up, if anyone thinks he can exclude philosophy and leave it aside as useless, he will eventually be defeated by it in some obscure form or other," end quote. Now, Karl Jaspers' opinion here has been shared by many thoughtful psychiatrists and psychologists and other mental health professionals ever since. Though Jaspers recognized that what he called, quote, "the correctness of scientific insights in general and in psychiatry is not proved by philosophy," end quote, he insisted that philosophy's exclusion could, in his opinion, only be disastrous for psychiatry. In his opinion, not only was philosophy needed to distinguish the different modes of knowing in the necessarily diverse disciplines concerned with psychopathology, it was also required in order to clarify methods and to organize our otherwise unruly knowledge into a comprehensive and coherent whole. Philosophy was, in Jaspers' opinion, also necessary in order to provide what he called a general illumination of existence. That is to say, of the dilemmas that the human condition poses for all of us. In order to understand the field of play within which a patient and her symptoms exist, and also to allow the doctor or therapist to achieve the self-illumination, as he called it, required for true empathy and understanding. Philosophy, quoting now from Jaspers, therefore creates the space for all the operations of our knowledge, end quote. The often nebulous, contestable, and decisively experiential nature of mental or emotional problems render philosophy indispensable to research, theory, and practice in the mental health professions. Now, Jaspers, as we all know, was an exceptionally broad thinker, with an ability both to appreciate and to criticize a wide variety of perspectives. He did, however, have a special respect and predilection for the phenomenological, existential, and hermeneutic traditions in Western thought. As he recognized, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche had offered valuable illuminations of the enigmas of freedom, death, and anxiety, while the phenomenology inspired by Edmund Husserl allowed for exploring the experiential dimensions of space, time, the self, and the overall sense or feeling of reality. All this suggested both the possibility and the need to consider these existential dilemmas, and also these phenomenological horizons, as they are expressed in various kinds of mental or emotional disorders studied in the field of psychopathology. Now, as we also know, phenomenological psychopathology begins with the work of a number of German, Swiss, and French psychiatrists, namely Karl Jaspers and his pupil Kurt Schneider, also, of course, Ludwig Binswanger and Eugene Minkowski, as well as such figures as von Gebsadel and Erwin Strauss. Key figures of a later generation would certainly include Wolfgang Blankenburg, the Japanese but German-educated psychiatrist Kimura Bin, and the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. A particularly important event was the meeting 100 years ago in Zurich that brought together Eugene Minkowski with Binswanger, thereby uniting the two most influential traditions of phenomenology and phenomenological psychopathology, which are the French and the German traditions. Now, the phenomenological approach to mental or emotional disorder has been applied to many different conditions, including depression, mania, paranoia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, eating disorders, borderline personality, and others, and also to schizophrenia, which is the form of psychopathology that historically has garnered the most attention in the field. Schizophrenia itself has been of special interest because of its severity, but also because of the seemingly bizarre or even incomprehensible nature of its most characteristic forms of experience and expression, which pose perhaps the greatest challenge to empathic understanding by other individuals. Now, the psychiatrists and psychologists of this tradition were influenced by the philosophers who, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, focused directly on the study of subjectivity. We might say, however, that this interest in human subjectivity, or at least in subjectivity of a certain kind, seems to have achieved its first, some might even say its noblest, Western apotheosis in the Renaissance works of those near contemporaries, Shakespeare and Rembrandt, and by others of their ilk, whose invention of the human, as it's been called, could be discussed. But full exploration of this dimension was deflected and somewhat delayed by the rationalist and objectivist spirit of the Enlightenment. The most crucial figures of the later 19th and early 20th centuries include Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, as well as Dilthey, William James, and Bergson. They, in turn, together with some predecessors, engender the sometimes parallel, sometimes overlapping traditions of phenomenology, hermeneutics, and existentialism, culminating in the 20th century quartet of Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre, writers whose themes are the lived world, the lived body, and the varieties and vicissitudes of self-awareness. This orientation toward subjectivity is evident, however, not only in philosophy, but also in the broader realms of art and culture, especially in those modern works, or modernist works, from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that precede and then accompany the development of phenomenology. That is to say, in 1,000 works of the literary and artistic avant-gardes, in which consciousness or its surrogates, whether in language or in paint, is allowed to thicken and draw attention to itself. And this surely was what Merleau-Ponty had in mind when he wrote that, quote, phenomenology was a movement before becoming a doctrine or a philosophical system, end quote. Going on, then he did, to liken phenomenology to the works of Proust, Valéry, and Cézanne. In such works, the ambition is to go beyond contemplation of even the most luminous face, to pass right through that surface membrane, no matter how thick, and then turn back to see the world from another within. All of these key philosophers were acutely aware of the enigmatic nature of human experience and of the need in studying it to go beyond the limitations and assumptions inherent in both objectivism and also in the standard common sense explanations of human action. The study of subjectivity, of human consciousness, or experiential life, has in fact long been recognized as being fraught with intellectual challenge. Our conscious living is that which is most directly present to us, yet its very nature often seems to evade standard forms of conceptual understanding and to elude our ongoing existential grasp. Most of our familiar concepts and categories have been honed through investigations of the objective or material world. So these concepts and categories often falter or fail when we turn them back onto our own subjectivity or selfhood. And this perhaps is part of what motivated the pre-Socratic poet-philosopher Heraclitus to issue his famous utterance, quote, "You will never find the boundaries of the soul, even if you follow every road, so deep is its measure." Now, Heraclitus wrote in the 6th and early 5th century BC. In the mid-20th century, the phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty expressed a similar sentiment by describing conscious awareness as what he called the flaw in the great diamond of the universe. He was actually borrowing an image from the poet Paul Valéry. What Merleau-Ponty meant, I think, is that consciousness is the foundation of any knowledge we may have. It is that by which the world of space, time, and causality comes to exist for us. Yet consciousness is itself quite indescribable in any third-person terms. It cannot be fitted into any objectivist picture of the world. Given these challenges, it is not difficult to understand why many researchers in psychiatry and clinical psychology have succumbed to various forms of objectivism, attempting to evade the enigmas of consciousness by eliminating any reference to subjectivity or the first-person perspective in their account of psychopathology. In their aversion to subjectivity, many such theorists have gone to the extreme of denying or dismissing either the availability or the relevance, sometimes even the very reality of experiential life. Consciousness for them simply disappears as a serious subject of investigation. The most obvious illustration of the challenge or incommensurability posed by the flaw in the great diamond is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. The apparent impossibility for us human beings, at least, of understanding just how the gray matter of the brain could possibly give rise to what's been called the purple haze of consciousness in all its ephemeral and irreducible glory. But even without attempting to integrate mind and brain into an overall explanatory account, consciousness by itself introduces another difficulty. This concerns the problem of how to go about describing the plane of subjectivity, given that its ever-changing, all-encompassing, and elusive qualities are not easily couched either in a physicalist vocabulary or in the everyday language of persons, things, and events. How can experience itself, including such issues as the felt passing of time, background awareness of one's body or spatial horizons, or the way in which the sense of selfhood may wax or wane, how can these be captured in a manner that is both reliable and accurate, or at least not too misleading? And how, in turn, might we understand the sometimes striking, sometimes subtle alterations of these experiences that seem typically to occur in such conditions as schizophrenia, mania, paranoia, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder? Perhaps the most basic issue, then, involves the challenge of observing and describing conscious life itself, whose ever-changing, all-encompassing flow we as human beings and language speakers are constantly tempted to misperceive or misdescribe. We succumb to this temptation, as William James reminded us, by using words that stress the substantive over the transitory aspects of experience, or by focusing on particular objects of awareness while ignoring subtle alterations in, for example, the overall experience of space, of time, or the atmosphere of reality. In fact, no approach can be fully bottom-up in the sense of being purely empirical or atheoretical. When it comes to describing experiences, patients as well as professionals are burdened, though also blessed, with the objectifying prejudices of their language and their worldview. The study of lived experience may then be impossible as a foolproof quasi-empiricist venture. It is, however, also indispensable, and to both the ethical and the scientific enterprise of psychiatry. A crucial lesson concerns then the element of ineffability, or at least the threat of ineffability, and perhaps unknowability that is lodged at the heart of subjectivity. As Nietzsche pointed out in his words, "We knowers are unknown to ourselves," end quote. This means that any overcoming of our unknowing, of our auto-unknowing, will require some active looking beyond the obvious. For as Nietzsche also insisted, sorry for the call going on in the background. For as Nietzsche also insisted, how can we ever hope to find what we have never looked for? And here, a familiarity with the findings of phenomenological philosophy and psychology must play a crucial role, because it can tell us the sorts of things we need to look for. In his 1912 article, which has already been mentioned in this conference, The Phenomenological Approach in Psychopathology, which is a founding text of our field, Karl Jaspers states that the point of the phenomenological approach is, quote, to further enrich our knowledge of what the psychiatric patient really experiences, end quote. Pursuing such enrichment does seem a valuable, even an indispensable enterprise, given its obvious relevance on several fronts. On a practical level, it seems natural to assume that a richer and more accurate understanding of a patient's experience would make valuable contribution to the planning and the conduct of psychological treatments. At the very least, a professional's ability to empathize with and understand and acknowledge and validate the nature of the patient's experience will help forge a stronger therapeutic alliance, which refers to the patient's overall sense of being well cared for and understood. It seems likely as well that a better understanding of subjective life in these realms might contribute something to our overall understanding of human existence in general. Given that even aspects of so-called normal experience can better be understood in light of the extreme states or limit conditions that can occur in various forms of psychopathology. Still another motive for this pursuit of phenomenological psychopathology, concerns the very definition and delineation of most psychiatric disorders. For it is doubtful that the phenomena of mental and emotional disorder could even be identified apart from recognizing the nature of the experiences suffered by the patients in question. Karl Jaspers criticizes materialism or reductive physicalism, the position of those who are drawn in exclusionary fashion to studying only what Jaspers calls the supposed extra-conscious base on which psychic events may seem to float like a thin layer of foam on the surface of the sea, end quote. While acknowledging the appeal of focusing on the physical plane, Jaspers insists that phenomenology is actually a prerequisite for any such investigation, even of the physical plane. This, he writes, is because it is, quote, only in the setting of these phenomenologically established forms that actual life unfolds itself. And it is, after all, in order to arrive at a better comprehension of this psychic life that we are prompted to investigate its extra-conscious relations, end quote. Here, Jaspers, together with virtually all philosophers and mental health experts in the phenomenological tradition, would agree with contemporary analytic philosophers who view subjectivity or experience as, quote, an explanandum, that is something to be explained in its own right, or who argue that without some idea of what the subjective character of experience is, we cannot know what is required of physicalistic theory. I'm quoting or paraphrasing David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel there. It seems we must, at the very least, articulate the nature of the explanandum. And this means that the study of subjectivity, phenomenology, is indispensable even for the project of naturalizing consciousness or the mind. Now, the science of psychiatry in general, mainstream psychiatry, has been in something of a crisis in the last couple of decades. And there's widespread recognition of stagnating progress in the field, especially regarding the most serious forms of mental disorder, as Thomas Insel famously acknowledged about 10 years ago. Perhaps the most promising potential new direction involves attempts to incorporate more sophisticated ways of understanding the experiential dimensions of the various conditions being studied. This, in turn, requires returning to the rich phenomenological tradition that began over 100 years ago, largely in Heidelberg, Germany, that flourished in mid-20th century Europe, and that is now undergoing a major renaissance in various countries, especially in Europe and South America. We see then that there are very good reasons for locating the study of subjectivity, and in particular, we see then that there are very good reasons for locating the study of subjectivity, and particularly the study of what it is like to suffer from emotional or mental disorder, at the very heart of the discipline of psychopathology, especially of phenomenological psychopathology, which in turn is the field that constitutes, or should constitute, the theoretical core of both psychiatry and clinical psychology. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Luis.